She walked into my baby's gender reveal smiling, confident, and absolutely certain she knew why she was there. What she didn't know was that the biggest surprise of the day had nothing to do with balloons or colors. Some celebrations change lives quietly. Others expose truths no one is ready to face. This one did both at the same time. By the end of that afternoon, nothing in our family dynamic would ever feel the same again. And the most unexpected part was how calm everything became afterward. This wasn't a story about conflict, but about clarity. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to the channel if you enjoy real-life stories with emotional twists and meaningful endings. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from, which city or country, because I love seeing how far these stories travel. Your presence here turns a personal experience into a shared conversation. Now take a breath, because this story starts gently, almost too gently, and that's what makes it unforgettable. Let me tell you how it all began. When I found out I was pregnant, my first emotion wasn't excitement, but responsibility, because I knew that every choice I made from that moment forward would shape not just a child, but an entire family dynamic that was already fragile beneath the surface. I wanted peace more than anything. Not perfection, just peace. Especially with my mother-in-law, whose presence had always been intense without ever being openly hostile. She was the kind of person who smiled warmly while quietly steering conversations back to herself. Nothing she did was technically wrong, yet everything somehow felt heavy. I convinced myself that a baby could soften that weight, that this new chapter might reset old patterns. Hope has a way of doing that. Planning the gender reveal felt symbolic to me, not as a performance, but as a moment of unity, something gentle and simple that would bring everyone together without tension or expectations. I didn't want anything extravagant, just close family, soft colors, and a sense of shared joy. There were no secret cameras, no dramatic countdowns, no loud announcements, just a small gathering in a familiar space. At least that's how it looked from the outside. Inside, I was carrying years of unspoken discomfort, and this event quietly held all of it. My mother-in-law reacted to the invitation almost immediately, her excitement spilling through her messages in a way that felt disproportionate to the simplicity of the event. She offered suggestions, ideas, changes, all framed as help, all politely declined. Each refusal was met with understanding, yet followed by another suggestion minutes later. It wasn't malicious, just persistent. I told myself it came from enthusiasm, that I was reading too much into things. Sometimes denial feels safer than confrontation. What I didn't realize then was how deeply she believed this moment belonged to her as much as it belonged to us. She spoke about the day as if she were hosting it, guiding it, shaping it. Her tone carried ownership, not entitlement, but expectation. That subtle difference is what made it hard to challenge. No one wants to seem ungrateful over something so small. And yet, those small moments accumulate. They settle quietly in your chest. As the days passed, I found myself thinking less about pink or blue and more about boundaries, about what it meant to become a parent while still feeling like a child around certain family members. Pregnancy has a way of sharpening awareness. You begin to see patterns you once ignored. You start asking yourself what kind of environment you want your child to grow up in, what behaviors you're willing to normalize, what silences you're ready to break. That realization changed everything for me. The gender reveal stopped being just a celebration and became a turning point, though no one else knew it yet. I wasn't planning a confrontation, and I wasn't setting a trap. I was simply done pretending that discomfort was harmless. There's a quiet strength that comes from deciding to be honest without being cruel. That was the energy guiding every choice I made, calm, deliberate, and firm, even if my hands shook while doing it. The morning of the event arrived with a strange sense of calm, the kind that settles in when a decision has already been made deep within you. I wasn't anxious about the guests or the reveal. I was focused, grounded, and surprisingly peaceful. The decorations looked exactly as planned, understated and warm. Nothing hinted at the emotional weight the room would soon hold. Everything appeared normal. That contrast made the moment even more powerful. As people began to arrive, laughter filled the space, and my mother-in-law positioned herself naturally at the center of the room, as if guided there by instinct. She looked comfortable, proud, and completely at ease. Watching her, I felt a mix of compassion and resolve. This wasn't about embarrassing her. It was about truth being acknowledged out loud for the first time. Sometimes growth doesn't come from arguments. It comes from quiet realizations. If at any point in this story you recognize familiar dynamics or emotions, feel free to comment and share your thoughts, because these experiences are more common than people admit. Reading how others relate creates connection, not judgment. And if you know someone who might see themselves in this situation, consider sharing this story with them. You never know who needs to feel understood today. Support doesn't always come with advice. Sometimes it's simply knowing you're not alone, and that understanding changes everything. As the room filled with familiar faces, I couldn't help but notice how naturally my mother-in-law assumed a role that hadn't been offered, greeting guests as if she were the host, and explaining details she hadn't planned. People listened politely, smiling, nodding, unaware that something subtle but important was happening beneath the surface. This wasn't new behavior, just a new setting. I had seen this pattern repeat itself for years, always small enough to ignore, always wrapped in good intentions. But standing there, pregnant and alert, I finally understood how those moments added up. They shaped dynamics quietly. They taught everyone where power lived. I used to tell myself that harmony meant staying quiet, that peace was something you preserved by not reacting, by letting things slide for the sake of family comfort. For a long time, that strategy worked, or at least it seemed to. There were no loud arguments, no dramatic fallouts, just a lingering sense of being slightly erased in my own moments. I convinced myself it was the price of maturity, that choosing not to engage made me the bigger person. But silence has a cost. Every suggestion she made, every decision she assumed, carried the same unspoken message, even if she never meant it that way. It said, "I know better," without using those words. And because it was never said directly, it was nearly impossible to challenge without sounding defensive. That's how these dynamics survive for so long. They exist in the gray area where no one feels justified enough to speak up, where discomfort is real but invisible, and invisibility is exhausting. Watching her interact with other relatives that day, I noticed how relaxed everyone seemed around her confidence. There's comfort in someone who takes control, even when that control isn't invited. It removes responsibility from others. It keeps things moving smoothly. But smooth doesn't always mean healthy. Sometimes it just means familiar, and familiar patterns are the hardest to change. Pregnancy changed my tolerance for that familiarity. It stripped away my ability to ignore what felt wrong. I wasn't just thinking about myself anymore. I was thinking about the environment my child would be born into, about the examples she would grow up watching, about what she would learn from how I allowed myself to be treated. That awareness was impossible to unsee. I remembered countless moments when I had minimized my feelings to avoid tension, telling myself it wasn't worth it. Moments when I smiled through discomfort because calling it out felt too complicated, too emotional, too risky. But standing there, surrounded by pastel decorations and polite laughter, I realized something important. Avoiding conflict doesn't eliminate it. It just buries it deeper, and buried things eventually surface. My partner noticed the shift in me long before that day. Even if we rarely spoke about it directly, there was an unspoken understanding between us. built from late-night conversations and shared glances at family gatherings. He knew I was tired of shrinking, and I knew he supported whatever boundaries I needed to set. That quiet alignment gave me strength, not the loud confrontational kind, but the steady kind that doesn't waver. As the conversations around me grew louder, my thoughts grew calmer, almost focused in a way I hadn't felt before. This wasn't about proving a point or correcting behavior. It was about clarity, about naming what had always existed without accusation. There's a difference between blame and truth. Truth doesn't need volume. It just needs space to be heard, and that space was finally opening. If you've ever felt this tension between keeping the peace and honoring yourself, I'd love to hear your experience in the comments. These moments look different in every family, but the feelings are often the same. Sharing your story might help someone else recognize their own patterns. And if this resonates with you, consider sharing this video with someone who might be struggling silently too. Sometimes a story arrives exactly when it's needed, and sometimes it gives permission to do things differently. That permission can be life-changing. At that point, most people in the room still believed they knew exactly what kind of reveal they were about to witness. They expected a color, a chair, a photo opportunity. They didn't know that the real reveal had nothing to do with gender. It had to do with awareness, with boundaries being seen instead of ignored, and with a quiet shift that was already underway, even before anything was said out loud. There was a moment, not long before everyone gathered around the table, when I stepped into another room and allowed myself to breathe without performing calm for anyone else. I placed my hands on my belly and felt a grounding stillness that surprised me. It was in that silence that my intention became crystal clear. This day was not about confrontation. It was about alignment, about ensuring that the life growing inside me would enter a world where honesty wasn't feared. That realization settled me completely. I thought about how often women are expected to adapt, to soften, to absorb discomfort so others don't have to feel uneasy, especially in family settings where gratitude is confused with compliance. I had played that role well for a long time, but becoming a mother shifted something fundamental in me. It made me aware that modeling self-respect was as important as providing love. That lesson felt urgent now, and it guided every step I took afterward. The idea itself hadn't come from anger, but from exhaustion, the kind that builds slowly when boundaries are tested again and again. I wasn't interested in proving anyone wrong. I just wanted to stop feeling invisible. There's a quiet power in choosing yourself without making a spectacle of it. That was the energy I carried back into the room, calm, intentional, and steady. No one noticed the shift, but everything had changed. The plan was simple, almost understated, which is why it worked. Nothing about it felt aggressive or dramatic. It relied on truth rather than reaction, on presence rather than volume. I trusted that the right people would understand, even if they didn't immediately like it. Growth often begins with discomfort, but discomfort doesn't have to be destructive. It can be clarifying. As I rejoined the group, my mother-in-law was laughing, telling a story that had everyone's attention. She looked confident, relaxed, certain of her place in the moment. Watching her, I felt compassion instead of resentment. She wasn't a villain in my story. She was a person shaped by habits that had never been questioned. And habits, once named, can change. That belief mattered to me. The decorations around us seemed almost symbolic now. Soft colors hiding something deeper underneath. Everyone was waiting for the cue, the signal that it was time for the reveal. Phones were ready, smiles were practiced. It struck me how quickly people move from anticipation to assumption. They thought they knew what was coming because it looked familiar. That familiarity was exactly what allowed truth to land gently. No one was on guard. My partner caught my eye and nodded slightly, a silent question and an answer all at once. That moment of shared understanding grounded me more than anything else could have. I wasn't alone in this. We were aligned in protecting our future, not just our feelings. There's strength in being supported without needing reassurance. It steadies your voice before you speak, and it reminded me why this mattered. I stepped forward, not with excitement, but with intention, and thanked everyone for being there. My voice didn't shake, even though my heart was racing. I spoke slowly, choosing each word carefully, not to soften the truth, but to honor it. The room quieted in a way that felt almost respectful. People sensed that something different was happening, and they leaned in. Before I continue, if you're finding meaning in this story, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss others like it. These stories are shared not to stir drama, but to explore real emotional moments with honesty and care. And if this resonates with you, feel free to leave a comment about what stood out most so far. Engaging in these conversations helps build understanding across experiences. And if you know someone who might benefit from hearing this, consider sharing the video with them. Sometimes reflection begins with someone else's courage, and sometimes that courage feels contagious. As I paused, holding everyone's attention, I realized how powerful silence can be when it's chosen, not forced. No one interrupted, no one joked. The energy in the room shifted from excitement to awareness. This was no longer just a celebration. It was a moment of collective listening, and in that space, truth had room to exist, exactly as it was meant to. I explained that becoming a parent had made me reflect deeply on the kind of environment I wanted my child to grow up in, one where love and respect existed side by side with clear boundaries. My words were calm, measured, and free of accusation, yet they carried weight because they were honest. I spoke about how moments that seem small can quietly shape relationships over time, about how good intentions don't always cancel out uncomfortable impact. The room remained silent, not tense, but attentive. People weren't waiting for a punchline anymore. They were listening. As I continued, I noticed my mother-in-law's smile soften, not disappear, but shift, as if something inside her had paused to catch up. She wasn't defensive, she wasn't embarrassed, she was surprised. For the first time, she seemed to be hearing how her presence had been felt, not just how it had been intended. That distinction changed everything. Awareness has a way of doing that. I made it clear that this wasn't about blame or rewriting the past, but about moving forward differently, about creating space for everyone to participate without taking over, about allowing moments to belong to the people they were meant for. My voice stayed steady, even when my heart felt full. I could sense understanding rippling through the group, not agreement necessarily, but recognition. And recognition is powerful. My mother-in-law finally spoke, her tone quieter than I'd ever heard it in this kind of setting. She didn't justify herself or argue, she simply acknowledged that she hadn't realized how her actions had been perceived. That admission, small as it might sound, landed heavily in the room. It wasn't a dramatic apology, it was something more rare. It was openness. In that moment, I felt something loosen inside me, a tension I hadn't realized I was still carrying, not because everything was suddenly resolved, but because the truth had been spoken and received. There was no need to push further, no need to explain again. Sometimes the first step is enough. Sometimes being heard is the resolution, and that felt like harmony in its own way. Around us, the energy shifted from curiosity to relief, as if everyone had been holding their breath without realizing it. Conversations resumed softly, with a new tone. People smiled differently now, less performative, more present. The celebration had transformed into something quieter and deeper, a shared understanding without spectacle. I looked at my partner and saw the same relief mirrored in his expression. This was the balance we had hoped for, not perfection, but respect, not silence, but awareness. It felt like a turning point, not just for that day, but for what came after. Growth doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it simply changes how people show up next time. As the moment settled, I gently reminded everyone why we had gathered in the first place. There was still joy waiting to be shared, still a life to celebrate. The mood lifted naturally, not forced, as anticipation returned in a new, calmer form. This time, it felt aligned, rooted in honesty rather than assumption, and that made all the difference. If this part of the story resonates with you, I invite you to comment your thoughts below. Moments of quiet understanding often leave the deepest impact. And if you believe conversations like this can help others, please consider sharing this video. You never know whose family dynamic might shift simply by hearing a story like this. Connection grows when experiences are shared, and sometimes shared stories create real change. That's why these moments matter. The box sat there patiently, unchanged, waiting to fulfill the purpose everyone thought it had. But now it carried something more than a color. It carried closure. It carried intention. It carried a new beginning layered over an old one. And when I reached for it, I felt ready. Not nervous, ready. I lifted the box slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle into my hands in a way that was both grounding and emotional. Everyone leaned in again, but this time the energy felt different, softer, more present. There was no rush, no pressure to perform, just a shared curiosity and a quiet sense of closure from what had already been said. I took a breath, smiled, and finally opened it. A gentle cascade of color filled the space, and the room responded with warmth, not noise. It was a girl. The realization moved through the room like a soft wave, bringing smiles, gentle laughter, and a collective sense of tenderness. No one shouted, no one competed for attention. It felt exactly how I had hoped it would feel from the beginning, centered, peaceful, whole. The reveal had found its moment. I placed my hand over my belly instinctively, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the timing of everything that had unfolded. This child was entering a family that had just taken its first step toward healthier patterns. That mattered more than any decoration or photo. I could see my mother-in-law watching quietly now, her expression thoughtful rather than expectant. There was no need to say anything else. The moment spoke for itself. Then I shared her name, a name that felt right from the moment we first said it out loud, a name that carried meaning without explanation. Her name would be Grace. The room grew still again, not with tension, but with emotion. Some names do that. They land softly, but deeply. Grace wasn't chosen to make a statement, yet it felt like one. It represented the way the day had unfolded. Honesty without cruelty, boundaries without rejection, understanding without humiliation. It felt like a quiet promise, not just to our daughter, but to ourselves, to lead with intention, to choose respect, even when it's uncomfortable. I noticed my mother-in-law nod slightly, as if something had settled within her too. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic reaction, just a shared understanding that this day had been about more than anyone expected. Sometimes meaning doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself gently when you're ready to see it. And that was enough. The room slowly filled with conversation again, but the tone had changed. It was warmer, slower, more genuine. People spoke about the name, about the baby, about the future. There was no lingering tension, only a sense of forward movement, the kind that doesn't erase the past, but doesn't live in it either. That balance felt rare and precious. If this reveal moved you in any way, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Stories like this often bring up personal reflections, and if you feel this message could resonate with someone you care about, please share this video with them. Moments of growth deserve to travel. They remind us that change doesn't have to be loud to be real. Sometimes it's quiet and lasting. As the gathering slowly came to an end, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was honest. Grace wasn't just a name anymore. She was a symbol of a new rhythm within our family, one built on awareness, on respect, and on calm strength. In the days that followed, nothing dramatic happened, and that was the most telling part of all. There were no confrontations replayed, no lingering, awkward conversations, no cold distance that needed to be managed. Instead, there was a noticeable shift in how space was shared. Conversations felt more balanced. Decisions felt more collaborative. The change was subtle but undeniable, and it felt sustainable. My mother-in-law began to ask instead of assume, a small adjustment that carried enormous meaning for me. She didn't announce this change or draw attention to it, she simply practiced it. That quiet effort spoke louder than any apology ever could have. It showed awareness without defensiveness, respect without submission, and growth without spectacle. I found myself responding differently too, no longer bracing for discomfort or rehearsing silence in advance. There was a new ease in our interactions, not closeness necessarily, but clarity. And clarity creates room to breathe. I wasn't guarding my moments anymore, I was present in them. That alone felt transformative. As my pregnancy progressed, I often thought about the day of the reveal and how perfectly imperfect it had been. It reminded me that harmony doesn't come from avoiding hard moments. It comes from facing them with intention and care. That lesson stayed with me. It influenced how I approached other relationships, how I spoke up, how I listened. Grace became more than a name we loved. She became a reminder of what that day taught us, that kindness and firmness can coexist, that honesty doesn't have to wound to be real, and that boundaries, when set with respect, can actually deepen connection. Those were lessons I hoped she would one day feel embodied in our family, not just hear about them. When Grace was born, she arrived into a space that felt lighter than the one I had known before. Not because people had changed completely, but because awareness had entered the room and stayed. That presence made all the difference. Family gatherings felt calmer, expectations felt clearer, and I felt more like myself within them. That sense of belonging mattered. Looking back, I understand now that the reveal wasn't about teaching anyone a lesson. It was about honoring myself at a moment when it mattered most. The ripple effect of that choice surprised me. It created respect without resentment, distance without disconnection, and peace without pretending. That balance is something I carry forward every day. If this story resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss others like it. These are real moments shared with care, meant to spark reflection rather than judgment. And if you haven't already, leave a comment with your thoughts or the city you're watching from. Your perspective adds to the conversation. And if this story might help someone you know, please share it with them. Sometimes one story is enough to open a door. Thank you for being here and listening. Harmony doesn't always arrive loudly or all at once. Sometimes it settles quietly, after truth has been spoken and received. That day didn't fix everything, but it changed how we moved forward. And that was enough, for me, for our family.